Can I bitch him? How can I beast mode him? How can I generally ruin his life? Victor, today you have a surprise for me. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, hit me.
I do have a surprise for you, and I've done a bit of a research to the history of rugby union, which is something peculiar, but something that you have asked, and so hopefully I can get you to learn something. I can teach you something new that you
How
haven't already
generous.
know. First of all, there is a beginning of rugby in the early 19th century. The first thing that we have to explain is that it comes from different forms of football, and it happens in England, where people played football with no unified rules, such as holding the ball with the hands. The key place that rugby evolves or goes around is rugby school. Each school had their own rules, and they played, for example, every week, they played once against each other. However, what was important about the evolution of rugby was the idea of running with the ball, because it became something new, something that British people hadn't really saw, sorry. However, it is very important to notice that rugby, even though many people think that it might have appeared suddenly, it actually evolved gradually from these chaotic games, because as I said, there were no unified rules. The next thing that we've got to explain are the first rules and the organization that rugby had. Something called the Rugby Football Union was created in the year 1871, and these led to the first international game that was between England and Scotland. And this was, as I said, the first international match. By this year in 1871, the rules were finally standardized. So people and the different teams had to play with the same rules. Like, for example, passing the ball backwards, tackling was introduced, as well as scrums, which were a method of restarting play. Next up, the biggest difference or the biggest event that happened for rugby was something called the Big Split, and this happened in the year 1895. What is the Big Split, you may say? Well, rugby, as I said, it was a chaotic game and it evolved into two different leagues, Rugby Union and Rugby League. This is one of the biggest turning points in the division because two divisions were created. However, though, the money was an issue because people didn't really have money to play this sport. There are two differences. For example, the northern part of England, rugby was played by the working class, and the Rugby Football Union was characterized by the amateurism. As a result, or as a consequence of these, two leagues formed: Rugby Union, which was amateur, and Rugby League, which was professional. This has to understand this, we have to make sure that we go back and we understand history as it was in England, because these years were in during the empire. There was a big class conflict in Britain, and it was not just exposed as in working classes, as in different elites, different classes that were working, people being poor and other being rich. This also reflected a conflict in rugby. As for the global expansion after the big split during the years 1900s and until more or less 1990, as I said, it is important to notice that as for the history context, we're speaking about the British Empire, which, for example, had New Zealand, South Africa, or Australia as countries that were part of the empire. And so this is the way that rugby was spread. It came from Britain, and thanks to British soldiers and colonial administrators, as well as finally elite schools or elite college, rugby was spread. So, as a consequence, these can be known as as a sport that was tied to imperial culture and control.
Okay.
In addition to that, some countries had a permanent British community. What is this? It is that British communities were constantly living in these countries, like I said, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, or in India, for example. The school systems were also key for the global expansion of the sport because they were copied exactly from Britain. And these introduced rugby and elite education. And there is something that we can explain that, for example, as you know, India, another part of the British Empire, that has cricket as the main sport, and you may think that why is it not rugby? And well, this is because there were no elite school in India. So that way, instead of rugby being popular, cricket was the one that dominated throughout the years. And for example, in the USA, something similar happened, but it is a bit different because instead of playing rugby, the Americans evolved towards American football with different rules and different structure of a game. Finally, in conclusion, we can say that rugby thrived because there were social structures supporting it, like in Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, France, etc., rather than simply because of exposure. Uh, One of the biggest nations in the origins were England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, the ones from the UK. And there was something introduced as the Six Nations. And something curious is that originally there were just five, so five nations. France, as a country, entered uh, during the first part of the 1900s, and they were excluded during the 1930s because of professionalism accusations. As for the next chapters of the rugby union, until 1995, they stayed amateur. And before 1995, players had jobs, they trained less, and they didn't get much money from playing the sport. And after 1995, there was a global growth and media appeal. Whereas, for example, the rugby league became professional way earlier. Finally, as for the professional era from 1995 until today, rugby union is professional now, and the Rugby World Cup was introduced first in in the year 1987, and so this is a global tournament involving all the teams that play rugby all the way through the world. And today, rugby has evolved into faster, more physical, and even more global, with huge media and commercial growth from the year 1995 as for the Rugby Union League. And finally, professionalism changed everything like tactics, fitness, and body types. And the change was made possible because of the competition that Rugby Union had with the Rugby League. And this made sure that good players, or maybe even elite players, were finally professional instead of being amateur with more money to gain and more global exposure. And this was the end of a term called shamateurism. And with this, I finished my presentation about speaking about the history of rugby union, and I hope you all have learned about the history of the sport as it is today.